The night was silent, yet sleep refused to enter the Johnson household. Cold air pressed against the wooden walls, and a single all lamp flickered as if trembling at what the morning would bring. It was America in 1775, where the word freedom was whispered with hope but paid for with fear. David Johnson sat at the edge of the table of folded paper, clenched in his hand. His eyes were distant outside. The sound of marching boots and passing horses cut through the darkness. The British Army was no longer just law, it had become terror. "Will you go?" Mary asked softly, her voice barely stronger than the flame between them. David did not answer at once. His gaze shifted to his sleeping son, unaware of the storm gathering over his future. "If I stay," David said quietly, "he will grow up in chains." Freedom was not a slogan. It was a debt paid in blood, separation, and footsteps that might never return home. Every man who lifted a rifle knew the truth. This fight might cost him everything. At dawn, as the sky turned pale, David put on his coat and lifted his weapon. He paused at the doorway. Mary said nothing. Her tears spoke the words she could not. The door closed behind him. It was not just a man who walked into the war. It was a family stepping into its trial. And in that moment, the Johnson family learned a truth history would never forget. Freedom is never free. It always demands a price. The house felt empty long before the silence settled in. Mary Johnson stood at the doorway long after David was gone, her eyes fixed on the road where his footsteps had disappeared. The war had taken him, but the waiting would take her. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. Letters arrived rarely, each one carrying hope wrapped in fear. Mary read every word slowly, as if rushing might steal the truth away. David wrote of cold nights, hunger, and men who fell beside him without a sound. He never wrote of his own fear. Their son Thomas grew quickly. He learned to chop wood, to carry water, and to ask questions his mother could not answer. "When will father come home?" Mary smiled when she answered, but her heart broke each time. Beyond their home, the war consumed everything. Towns were searched, supplies seized, and loyalty questioned. British soldiers marched through the countryside, reminding everyone that neutrality was no longer an option. Survival meant choosing a side even when the cost was unbearable. One evening, a knock came at the door. Mary's breath caught. For a moment, she believed it was David. Instead, it was a wounded messenger, delivering news from the front. Battles were growing fiercer, losses were heavy. That night, Mary prayed not for victory, but for survival. The war was no longer far away. It had entered their home, and the distance between husband and wife was no longer measured in miles, but in fear. The battlefield did not look like the songs or speeches had promised. There was no glory here, only mud, blood, and the constant smell of smoke. David Johnson stood among men who no longer looked like farmers or fathers. War had stripped them down to survivors. The first cannon blast tore through the morning air like thunder. Men froze for a heartbeat, then chaos erupted. Shots rang out, bodies fell, and orders were swallowed by screams. David fired his rifle with shaking hands, not knowing if he had hit an enemy or fate itself. Around him, boys cried for their mothers. Friends collapsed without warning. Time lost meaning. The ground became slick with blood, and the sky seemed indifferent to the suffering below. David fought not for medals or recognition. He fought for a small wooden house, a woman waiting by the door, and a child who deserved a future without chains. Then it happened. A sharp pain exploded through his side. David fell hard, the breath knocked from his lungs. The world blurred as he pressed his hand against the wound, feeling warm blood soak through his fingers. Above him, the battle raged on, uncaring. As night fell, the field grew quiet, not peaceful but hollow. The wounded lay scattered, calling out names that would never answer. David was dragged to a makeshift camp, his strength fading with every breath. In the flickering light of a dying fire, he reached into his coat and pulled out a small folded letter he had never sent. It was for Mary, words he might never speak. For the first time since the war began, fear overcame resolve. Not fear of death, but fear of never going home. And far away under the same sky, Mary felt a heaviness she could not explain, as if the war itself had whispered his name. The letter arrived on a gray morning. Mary recognized the handwriting, instantly uneven, strained, yet unmistakably. Her hands trembled as she held the paper, afraid that opening it might steal what little hope remained. For a long moment she simply stared at it, listening to her own heartbeat. Then she read, "David wrote of the battle. Though he spared her the worst of it, he spoke of courage of men who stood there, ground of a belief that freedom was still worth the cost." But between the lines Mary felt the weight of his pain. Every word felt slower, heavier, as if written by a man unsure of how much time he had left. Near the end his writing faltered. "If this letter reaches you," he wrote, "know that every step I took was for you and Thomas. I do not regret this choice. Freedom must begin somewhere, even if it does not begin with me." Mary's breath caught, tears blurred the page, but she kept reading, refusing to stop. The room felt smaller, quieter, as though the world itself was holding its breath. That night she sat beside Thomas as he slept, watching his chest rise and fall. She wondered how much truth a child should carry and how much silence a mother must endure. Outside, the wind howled, carrying rumors of another battle, another loss. Days passed, no new letters came. Each knock at the door felt like a verdict. Each sunrise brought both relief and dread. Mary prayed not for miracles anymore, only for answers, because waiting, she realized, was its own kind of battlefield. And sometimes the letter you receive is not the one that decides your fate, but the silence that follows it. The knock came just after dawn. Mary knew before she opened the door. Two men stood outside, one in uniform, the other holding a head against his chest. Their faces carried the weight of words no one ever wants to deliver. The world seemed to slow, as if giving her one last moment before everything changed. Mrs. Johnson. That was all it took. David had not died instantly. He had lived long enough to ask for water, long enough to speak his wife's name, long enough to press the folded unsent letter into a fellow soldier's hand and ask that it be delivered. He had died believing freedom would come, even if he would not live to see it. Mary did not scream. Grief settled into her quietly, heavily, like snow covering everything she once knew. She thanked the men. She closed the door, and only then did she fall to her knees, clutching the letter that had now become a goodbye. Thomas watched from the corner of the room. He did not cry, he did not speak. Something in him hardened, not into anger, but into understanding. Childhood ended that morning. The war eventually moved on. Battles were won and lost. Names were written into history books, while countless others were forgotten. David Johnson became one of those forgotten names. But in that small wooden house, his absence was louder than any cannon. Freedom was coming, everyone said so. But Mary had learned the truth too well. Freedom does not arrive gently. It takes what it must and leaves the living to carry the cost. The war ended quietly, almost like the world itself had grown tired. Guns fell silent, flags were lowered. Soldiers returned home, some whole, some broken in body or spirit. Yet for the Johnson family, the battle was far from over. Mary stood at the doorstep, watching Thomas run across the fields, carrying the small tools his father had once used. He was growing up fast, learning to survive, learning to live with the absence that had reshaped their lives. Freedom had arrived, but it had not healed the wounds nor filled the empty spaces left behind. The neighbors spoke of victory, parades, and new beginnings, but Mary knew the cost of freedom would remain with every family who had given something irreplaceable. She kept David's letter, carefully reading it when the nights were long and the wind whispered through the house. It reminded her that courage mattered, that sacrifice mattered, even when it felt unbearably cruel. Thomas asked her sometimes why his father never returned. Mary would smile faintly and say, "He's here in the choices we make, in the life we build, in the freedom you now have." Years passed. The fields grew, crops, the house remained sturdy, and the Johnson family survived their story. Was not written in books, not celebrated in cities, but it lived quietly in their hearts, a testament to the price paid so that freedom could be born. And so the Johnsons, like countless others, learned a profound truth. Liberty is precious, but it demands courage, sacrifice, and sometimes everything you hold dear.